The morning London was wrapped in a thin silver mist, the kind that softens everything and makes the city look like a painting. Tourists moved in slow clusters along the iron gates of Buckingham Palace, cameras raised, voices low. All of them caught in the quiet spell of one of the most famous addresses in the world. Pigeons strutted across the wet cobblestones. A red double-decker bus rolled past on the road behind. And somewhere in the middle of that familiar, orderly scene stood Danny Cole, a 28-year-old from Nashville, Tennessee, already scanning for trouble. Danny had arrived in London 3 days earlier on what he called his victory trip. He had just crossed 50,000 followers on his social media page, a channel he had been running for 2 years built almost entirely on pranks. Not dangerous ones, he would always tell people, just funny ones. The kind that made strangers laugh in public. The kind that racked up views by the thousands within hours of being posted. He traveled with a small backpack, a GoPro strapped to his chest, and a mindset that treated the world like one large stage, waiting for its next performance. London had been on his list for a long time. Not for the museums, or the history, or the food. How he had eaten fish and chips twice already and admitted they were better than expected. London was on his list because of the Royal Guards. He had seen videos of them on his feed for years, tourists making silly faces inches from their expressionless helmets. People shouting jokes that earned not even a flicker of reaction. Children pulling at their sleeves only to be met with absolute iron-cast stillness. It fascinated him. It challenged him. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a plan had already been forming long before. His plane touched down at Heathrow. The guard Danny fixed his eyes on that morning stood at his post near the palace gate with the rigid posture of someone who had trained years to make stillness look effortless. His name, though Danny did not know it yet, was Corporal James Harrington, 26 years old, serving member of the British Army with 4 years of active duty behind him. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, made even more imposing by the full ceremonial uniform. The deep red tunic buttoned to the throat, the enormous black bearskin hat that added nearly a foot to his already considerable height. His eyes stared forward. His jaw was set. His white-gloved hands gripped the ceremonial rifle in perfect alignment with his body. He had stood at this exact post more than 30 times. He knew the sound of every kind of tourist, the curious ones, the respectful ones, the ones who whispered to their children that the guard was a real person, not a statue. He also knew the other kind, the ones who crept a little too close, the ones who made a show out of testing him. He had been trained to expect all of them, to let none of them reach him. His composure was not just discipline, it was pride. And beneath the red tunic and the towering hat, it was also something more personal, something that had been earned through experiences most people standing on that pavement could not begin to imagine. Danny moved closer, the GoPro light blinking red on his chest. He had spent the previous evening in his hotel room, planning exactly this. He had rehearsed what he would say to the camera, practiced the laugh he would give after, and tucked a small water pistol into the front pocket of his hoodie, bright yellow. The kind sold in toy shops filled with cold tap water that morning before he left. He told himself it was harmless. Just water. The guard would stand there, get a little wet. The crowd would gasp and then laugh. The video would pop. Easy content. He had done harder things for fewer views. He positioned himself about 3 feet from the guard's post and turned slightly so the GoPro would capture both his face and the guard's. A small crowd had already formed. Nearby, a family from Japan with matching a pair of teenagers with backpacks, an older British couple who had stopped to point something out to each other above the gate. None of them knew what was about to happen. Danny took a slow breath, reached into his hoodie pocket, and wrapped his fingers around the yellow water pistol. He looked into the camera and gave a small, mischievous smile. Then he raised his arm and squeezed the trigger. The thin stream of cold water caught Corporal Harrington directly on the left side of his face, running down his cheek and along the edge of his jaw before dripping onto the red collar of his tunic. The crowd went completely quiet. Someone, somewhere, made a short, sharp sound. Not quite a gasp, not quite a laugh, Danny held his grin in place for the camera and waited for the non-reaction he had promised himself he would get. Just a still face. Just a statue of a man letting the moment pass. That was the joke. That was the content. That was supposed to be the whole story. But Corporal James Harrington did not stay still. For one long second, nobody moved. The water dripped from the guard's jaw onto the red wool of his collar. Danny kept the smile fixed on his face, the yellow water pistol still raised in his right hand, his eyes watching the guard's expression for that perfect, frozen blankness that would make the video what he had imagined. The family with the sun hats had gone very still. The two teenagers looked at each other. The British couple near the gates stopped talking altogether. The whole small corner of the world outside. Buckingham Palace held its breath. Then Corporal James Harrington moved his eyes. Not his head. Not his body. Not his hands, or the rifle, or a single inch of his composed ceremonial posture. Just his eyes, sharp, dark, and suddenly fully alive, shifted from the middle distance directly to Danny's face. It was a small movement, barely visible to most of the crowd. But Danny saw it. He felt it before he even understood what was happening. The guard was looking at him. Not through him, not past him, not at the blank horizon that ceremonial guards were supposed to stare into forever. James Harrington was looking directly at Danny Cole. What was in that gaze stopped the grin cold on Danny's face. It was not anger. That was the strangest part. Danny had half prepared himself for a flash of anger, something that would prove the guard was human, something that would add drama to the video. But there was no anger in those eyes. There was something far harder to put a name to. There was a weight behind them. Kind of weight that belongs to a person who has seen things and carried them quietly ever since. It was a look that did not need words. It communicated something with a precision that no sentence could have managed. It said, "I see you. I know exactly what you are doing, and I am choosing what happens next." Danny lowered the water pistol slightly. His smile had dropped without him deciding to drop it. He was not scared, exactly. He was something else caught off guard by the feeling that a joke he had planned for days had suddenly become something much smaller than the moment it had just walked into. Then Corporal Harrington stepped out of his post, not backward, not to call for help. He stepped forward, one clean, measured step that brought him within 2 feet of Danny, and he turned his body slightly so that he was facing the younger man directly. The ceremonial rifle remained in position. His posture remained perfect. He had not broken form in any technical sense. But the distance between them was different now, and the crowd shifted instinctively, pressing back a little, as though they understood that whatever was about to happen deserved space. Harrington did not raise his voice. He did not gesture or point or call attention to himself in any theatrical way. He simply opened his mouth, calmly, and spoke. His voice was low but clear, the kind of voice that carries without effort. He said 5 words that nobody standing there that morning expected to hear, and those 5 words landed in the silence like stones dropped into still water. "My brother died in uniform." That was all. 5 words. Then Corporal Harrington stepped back to his post, resumed his exact original position, fixed his gaze on the middle distance, and became still again, as though nothing had happened. As though he had not just handed a room full of strangers something they would carry with them for a very long time. The crowd did not laugh. Nobody clapped. Nobody said a word for what felt like a long time. One of the teenagers put a hand over her mouth. The older British man took a slow step back and removed his glasses and polished them carefully, the way people do when they need something to do with their hands. The mother from the Japanese family quietly pulled her youngest child close to her side. Danny Cole stood exactly where he was, the yellow water pistol dangling at his side, his GoPro light still blinking red, recording everything. He did not know yet what the guard's words would mean to the world. He did not know yet that someone in the crowd had been recording on their phone and that the footage would spread across platforms within hours. He did not know that James Harrington's 5 words would be shared in dozens of languages, written about in newspapers from London to Los Angeles, read aloud on radio programs, and discussed in military veterans groups and family dinner tables across several continents. He did not know any of that yet. What he knew in that moment, standing on the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace with cold water drying on a brave man's collar, was a feeling he had not expected. It rose up through his chest without warning. Hot and uncomfortable, and completely impossible to film or caption or turn into content. It was shame. Simple, honest, undiluted shame. Not the kind that passes in a minute, but the kind that settles in and begins asking questions about who you are and what you thought was funny and why. He clicked the GoPro off. He put the water pistol back in his pocket. And for the first time in 2 years of making videos about other people's reactions, Danny Cole had absolutely no idea what to do next. The video appeared online that same afternoon. It had been filmed by a 22-year-old student from Bristol named Priya, who had been visiting the palace with a friend and had her phone out simply to take photographs. She had not planned to record anything significant. She had caught the moment almost by accident. The water pistol, the dripping tunic, the long pause. The guard's measured step forward, and then those 5 words. Quietly spoken and perfectly captured by her phone's microphone from 6 feet away. She posted it without much thought, adding a short caption that read simply, "Didn't expect this today." By midnight, it had been viewed 400,000 times. By the following morning, the number had passed 3 million. By the end of the week, the clip was everywhere. News channels in the United Kingdom picked it up. American morning programs played it. A French broadcaster ran a segment on it. Veterans organizations shared it on their pages with messages of solidarity and respect. Comment sections filled with people who had lost brothers, fathers, sons, and friends in uniform. All of them writing that those 5 words had said something they had never quite been able to say themselves. Something raw and real and unscripted, spoken not in grief, but in dignity. From a man who chose not to rage, not to break, not to retaliate, but simply to be honest. The story behind those 5 words began to surface slowly in the days that followed. Pieced together through sources close to the Harrington family, and eventually through a brief, carefully worded statement released by a military spokesperson. Corporal James Harrington had a brother named Thomas, 3 years older, soldier in the same regiment, someone James had looked up to his entire life. Thomas Harrington had been killed on duty during a peacekeeping operation 2 years before the morning at the palace gate. He was 27 years old. He left behind parents, a younger sister, and a brother who had decided in the weeks after the funeral that the best way to honor Thomas was to keep doing the thing they had both always done, to serve. To stand, to wear the uniform with the same pride Thomas had worn it with every single day of his adult life. People who read this did not simply feel sympathy. They felt something deeper, something that the world does not always make room for, a recognition of. What it costs to stand still while the world mocks what you love? Because James Harrington had not stood at that post all those mornings as a statue, or a tourist attraction, or a piece of ceremonial furniture. He had stood there as an act of devotion. Every hour on duty was an hour spent inside the meaning of a thing he and his brother had believed in together. The bearskin hat was not a costume. The red tunic was not a performance. The rifle was not a prop. They were a living tribute. And on the morning, Danny Cole raised a yellow water pistol and squeezed the trigger. He had not aimed it at a guard. He had aimed it at all of that. James himself did not give interviews. He did not seek attention or try to benefit from what had happened. Colleagues who knew him described a man who was uncomfortable with the attention and would have preferred the moment to have remained between himself and the tourist on the pavement. He had not spoken out of a desire to shame anyone publicly. He had spoken because in that specific moment, something came up from inside him that was simply true. And the only honest response to being disrespected while wearing his brother's legacy was to say so quietly, clearly, and then to let the stillness take over again. What surprised many people who watched the video closely was not just what Harrington said, but what he did not do. He did not curse. He did not shove. He did not call for assistance or make a show of his authority. He had an enormous amount of power in that moment. Physical power. Institutional power. The power of public sympathy, and he used none of it to harm or humiliate the person in front of him. He used 5 words. And then he went back to doing his job. There was a discussion that ran for days online about what exactly made the moment so powerful, and why it struck people so deeply in a way that a dramatic response never could have. A former military officer wrote a long post about it that was widely shared, arguing that what Harrington demonstrated was the rarest and most difficult form of strength, the kind that does not need to prove itself through force, the kind that comes from a person who has already survived something truly hard, and who has learned that how you carry yourself in small moments is just as important as how you carry yourself in the large ones. The officer ended the post with a line that many people saved and shared. He didn't break because he had already been broken and put back together by something bigger than a prank. Danny Cole read all of this from his hotel room in London, sitting on the edge of the bed with his phone in both hands, scrolling through comment after comment, article after article, share after share. He had not posted a single thing since the moment at the palace gate. His GoPro footage sat unwatched in his camera roll. He had eaten nothing since breakfast. He had called his mother in Nashville and said he did not want to talk about it yet, which was the most honest thing he had said all trip. He read about Thomas Harrington, and he read it again, and he sat with it in the quiet of a London evening while the city moved on outside the window. He had come to London looking for a reaction. He had found one, just not from the person he expected, and not the one he had planned for at all. The reaction he found was his own, and it was the beginning of something. Danny Cole extended his stay in London by 4 days. He told the airline it was a change of plans. He told himself it was because he needed to think. Both of those things were true, but neither of them was the whole truth. The whole truth was that he could not bring himself to board a plane and go home and return to his ordinary life as though the morning outside Buckingham Palace had been a bump in the road. Rather than a wall he had walked straight into, he needed to sit in the city where it had happened for a little while longer. He was not entirely sure what he was looking for, but he sensed it was still here somewhere, waiting for him to be still enough to find it. He spent those 4 days doing things he had never thought to do on the trip. He visited the National Army Museum in Chelsea and stood in front of exhibits he would normally have walked past. He read the names on plaques. He looked at photographs of soldiers from different eras, young faces in old uniforms, some of them barely old enough to shave, all of them looking out from the frames with that particular kind of seriousness that belongs to people who have accepted a weight most people never carry. He read about what soldiers give up, what their families carry, what a uniform actually means to the person inside it. He spent a long time in a room dedicated to fallen soldiers and did not take out his phone once. Back in Nashville, the story had already arrived before him. His friends had seen the video. His family had seen it. A few of his fellow content creators had messaged him, some with sympathy, some with the kind of nervous humor people use when they are not sure what else to say. His comment sections had been quiet since the incident, his followers watching and waiting to see what he would do. In the world of online content, silence was unusual. Silence usually meant something was being prepared. Some response, some comeback, some carefully worded video that would either double down or perform a very public act of remorse for the algorithm. People expected one or the other. Very few expected what Danny actually did. On the evening before his rescheduled flight home, Danny sat down in his hotel room and wrote a letter. Not a post. Not a video. A letter, handwritten on paper he bought from a small stationery shop near his hotel. The kind of letter that takes time and cannot be edited with a tap of a finger. He wrote it to Corporal James Harrington. He did not try to make it clever. He did not try to explain or justify or minimize what he had done. He wrote what he actually felt, which was harder than anything he had ever scripted for a camera. He wrote that he had been foolish and careless, and that he had treated a man's dignity as entertainment without stopping to consider what that man might be carrying. He wrote that he had read about Thomas. He wrote that he was sorry for that loss in a way that had nothing to do with the video or the views or the public response, and everything to do with one person acknowledging another person's pain with the only currency that actually matters, which is honesty. He folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope. and arranged through his hotel concierge to have it delivered to the appropriate military administrative office with a request that it be passed along. He did not know if it would reach James Harrington. He did not know if James would read it or respond, or if it would simply be filed away somewhere and forgotten. He sent it anyway, because some things need to be done regardless of whether they are received. The letter became public. It's eventually not through Danny, but through a military staff member who leaked it to a journalist who published a carefully anonymized excerpt. The response to the letter was different from the response to the video. The video had made people feel the injustice of what happened. The letter made people feel something more complicated, a cautious, tentative recognition that the young man with the water pistol was not simply a villain, but a person who had been thoughtless and who was now trying, imperfectly and without guarantee of forgiveness, to become something slightly better. Not all comments were generous. Many people felt that no letter could undo what had been done publicly in front of a crowd. But many others wrote that accountability, real accountability offered without the promise of reward, was rarer than outrage and deserved to be acknowledged when it appeared. Danny posted nothing for 3 weeks after returning to Nashville. When he finally did post again, it was not a prank video. It was a quiet, unedited clip. No music, no cuts, no title card of himself sitting at a table, speaking directly to the camera without performance. He talked about the morning at the palace. He talked about Thomas Harrington. He talked about what he had read in those 4 extra days in London, about what a uniform means and what grief looks like when it is transformed into service. He did not cry on camera. He did not play for sympathy. He spoke plainly and admitted that he had built an audience on the discomfort of strangers and that he had never once asked himself whether those strangers had earned the right to their stillness, to their dignity, to whatever private world lived behind their faces. The video was watched 12 million times in its first 48 hours. It became the most seen thing he had ever posted. People who had never followed him subscribed in their hundreds of thousands. Former military families wrote to him. Veterans organizations tagged him. But none of that was why he had made it. He had made it because Corporal James Harrington had given him 5 words in a long silence. And somewhere inside that silence was a question Danny had decided he finally needed to answer out loud. 6 weeks after the morning at the palace gate, Danny Cole received a reply. It came not through any official channel or media organization, but through a plain envelope sent to his P.O. box in Nashville, an address he had listed publicly for fan mail years ago and mostly forgotten about. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short paragraph written in a neat, careful hand. There was no dramatic speech, no grand declaration, no invitation to appear together in some televised reconciliation that would make good television and mean very little. James Harrington wrote simply that he had received the letter, that he had read it, and that he accepted the apology. He wrote one further sentence that Danny read several times before folding the paper carefully and putting it, Kate, in the inside pocket of his jacket. I don't believe people are defined by the worst thing they do. I believe they are defined by what they do next. Danny did not post the letter. He did not photograph it or share it or use it as the final beat of any kind of public narrative. He kept it. He carried it with him for months in that jacket pocket, paper softening slightly at the folds from being taken out and read and put back again. It became, without any announcement, the thing he returned to when he needed to remember what had changed in him, and why that change was worth protecting. What he did post, 2 months after returning from London, was an announcement. He had spent those weeks working quietly, making phone calls, writing emails, speaking to people he had never spoken to before. Veterans support organizations, military charities, people who worked with the families of fallen soldiers. He had learned that one of the largest gaps in support for those families was not financial, at least not always. It was visibility. It was the feeling that the world had moved on from a loss, that the family was still living inside every single day. He announced that he was redirecting his channel. Not entirely. He was not abandoning the lightness and the humor that had built his audience in the first place. But he was adding something. Once a month, using his platform and his reach, he would tell the story of a fallen soldier with the permission and involvement of their family. Not as a performance of grief. Not as emotional content designed to generate engagement. simply as what it was. A name, a face, a life that deserved to be remembered by more people than currently remembered it. The first episode featured Thomas Harrington. James had agreed to it quietly, through an intermediary, with one condition, that Thomas be shown as Thomas. As a person who loved football and terrible action films and cooking for his family on Sundays, not simply as a sacrifice or a symbol, Danny honored that condition with everything he had. The episode was careful and warm and full of the specific ordinary details that make a person real rather than just meaningful. It was not the most viewed thing Danny ever produced, but it drew more messages than anything else he had ever made. Thousands of them. From people who had lost someone and never seen their person's story told by a stranger. With kindness, James Harrington continued his service. He gave no interviews and sought no recognition beyond the quiet daily act of returning to his post and standing in it with the same dignity he had always carried. The moment at the palace gate remained the most discussed thing he had ever done, but he did not regard it as the most important. The most important things, as far as he was concerned, happened in the ordinary hours, the early mornings before the tourists arrived, the cold afternoons when the sky over London turned the color of pewter, the moments between moments when he stood inside the uniform and felt the weight of what it meant and said nothing out loud. Because nothing out loud was necessary, people still talk about those 5 words. They have been printed on posters and painted on walls and quoted in sermons and shared in social media bios. They have been used in arguments about dignity and respect and the price that military families pay for a public that sometimes forgets to look past the ceremony to the human being inside it. They have been taught in schools as an example of how to respond to provocation without cruelty. They have been whispered by parents to children who asked what strength really looks like. But perhaps the truest testament to what happened that morning outside Buckingham Palace is simpler than any of that. It is the fact that 2 young men, one who had lost a brother and one who had never lost anything, left that encounter changed. One of them had not been looking for transformation when he raised a yellow water pistol in the London mist. He had been looking for views. He found, instead, something that cannot be filmed or captioned or measured in follower counts, a moment of genuine reckoning with who he was and who he still had the chance to become, and the man who gave him that chance did not do it with anger or a lecture or a performance of his own suffering. He did it with 5 plain words and the kind of stillness that only comes to a person who has already faced something far harder than a prank and come through it standing. Some people spend their whole lives building that kind of quiet. Corporal James Harrington had already earned it. He just chose on an ordinary misty morning in London to let someone else borrow it long enough to find their own.